people who were not naturalized citizens were declared enemy aliens. So, a description that was revoked on Columbus Day in 1942. Tony, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, his mother was described as an enemy alien while her son was fighting to defend this country. And a story that's receiving more attention now is those individuals of Italian descent who might have even been interned. There was an apology recently in California about the wartime treatment of Italian Americans. Before the Second World War, there were questions in many parts of America about the Italian immigrants and their descendants. Are they Italian? Are they American? Or are they something in between? The Second World War answered this question definitively once and for all. The typical person of Italian descent is proud of her or his heritage, and rightfully so. But at the same time, this person is unmistakably, unequivocally, undeniably American. In the years after World War II in southern Colorado, as was the case throughout America, folks came back from the war and otherwise benefited from the newfound acceptance, and they had newfound confidence. And as they were rising up through the ranks of communities, started their businesses, received and earned and held good jobs, were elected to political office, and did all kinds of wonderful things. About 20 years ago, we reached a milestone in Pueblo whereby 4 of the 7 city council members were Italian Americans at a place where folks from Italian backgrounds are no more than 10% of the population. As recently as 1970, a man who's now in his early 60s remembers a young woman telling him she couldn't date him in Pueblo because my father, she said, doesn't let me date Italians. Today, he is a civic leader in the community, and Italian Americans are very well represented in every field of endeavor there. If you were to say to a young person, someone who maybe is young enough to be my son or daughter, there was a time when you might not have been able to date someone because your people, at least some of them, came to this country from Italy, or you might not be able to gain entry to a nightclub when you're old enough, that young person would look at the person saying it as if he or she were a Martian. It wouldn't even occur to him or her that something like that would happen. A sign of the progress, the acceptance, and inclusion. Now, there are 2 sticking points that we must note when we look at the Italian American story. And ours is a very positive program tonight. The first of which is there is some stereotyping in our country related to Italian Americans, generally but not exclusively having to do with organized crime. As we all know, over the years, 99.9% of the more than 17 million Americans of Italian origin have done everything that you're supposed to do in America, often coming to this country in grinding poverty, often growing up in large families where there was no money, where the breadwinners in the family would go out and work many hours for low pay. And it must be remembered that very, very few of the children who grew up in those households ever turned to crime, even though some people in the neighborhood might have seen it as the easy path. I have first-hand familiarity with the conditions that our ancestors left, in many cases in Italy. And it should be noted, not every immigrant who came to this country from Italy was poor. I want to make that very clear. But the solid majority of them were. My great-aunt Michelina, who was born in 1910, came here in the 1920s, died in 1995, never learned to read or write in her native country or here, because by the time she arrived in America, the family wanted her to get out there and help support them. One time in the 90s, when she was still living, I asked her, I said, why don't you go back to Italy, Calabria, which is still a poor region, but Italy today is a very rich country, so even a poor region in a rich country is richer than most parts of the world. I said, Aunt Mickey, as we called her, why don't you go back to Italy? You know, you work different jobs, you have a house, you have a car, you have a little bit of money in the bank. And she goes, no, there's no food. She had an idea in her head from when her people, my people, left Italy, they did not have enough to eat. And now if you think about, even with the tough times that we're experiencing in America today, we're still lucky to be part of what is the richest and most powerful country in the history of the world. I, like a number of Americans and descended from people who during the Great Depression walked along the railroad tracks picking up coal so they'd be warm in the winter. Or I should say not as cold. Now, all of us have these stories. That's why for many people of Italian descent, when folks imply that the success of Italian Americans is related to illegitimate means and illegitimate activities, people are rightfully offended. Now, when we look at this topic, I'd like to cite that while organized crime involving Italian Americans has existed and continues to exist today, it is rapidly fading into history for a variety of reasons. And I'll list them in no particular order. One, the traditional rackets that these men engaged in are, in a number of cases, drying up. Because of investigations and prosecutions, many of these fellows have been put out of business, behind bars or otherwise put out of business. This being America, a great country with a tremendous amount of diversity in many ways. People from virtually every ethnic, racial, and cultural background are represented in organized crime. And quite frankly, the Italian-American gangsters have not been faring well in competition with them lately. And fourth, I am by no means an apologist for criminality. In fact, I go in the other direction. But the pockets of poverty that once served as recruiting areas for the organized crime families in New York and other parts of our country, they have disappeared in the Italian-American community. The days when a John Gotti in New York went to school in the 40s and 50s wearing mismatched shoes, and he saw his father going off to work, an honest day's job, 10 hours a day with a huge family, and that kid might not want to take the right path. And we will all condemn him for doing that because most of the kids did that. Those days are gone. Now, in our community, in the Italian-American community, if you get together 40 or 50 people, as we have tonight, there are different opinions about such programs as The Sopranos and The Godfather. And I want to respect everyone's opinion, so I'm not going to cast judgment. I'll just say this. I know people who are angered by such programming to the point that they almost have tears in their eyes, and I also know people who subscribe to HBO because they wanted to get The Sopranos, and there are many folks in between. Every one of us in this room who is a friend of Italy and or a person of Italian descent, or someone who's married to a person of Italian origin, is doing wonderful work to combat stereotypes just by your very example. It's easier if you see Tony Soprano on the small screen or Michael Corleone on the big screen. It's easier possibly to associate those images with an entire group of people when you don't know Frank or Gina in your day-to-day lives. Today, when people of Italian descent are admired, valued, and respected communities throughout America, as more and more people move throughout the country in search of jobs and because of marriage, because of education and so forth, more and more of our people have first-hand familiarity with Italian Americans as their friends, their neighbors, their colleagues, their classmates, and increasingly because of intermarriage. At least 90% of younger Italian Americans marry out. And this is a sign of acceptance and inclusion. It is one of the most important indicators, bar none, showing how folks are literally and metaphorically being embraced by people from other ethnic backgrounds. Let me just share one anecdote, and then we'll get to customs and traditions. In January of 2005, I was a guest on a radio program in El Paso, Texas. The gentleman who was the host was talking about different issues related to Italian American culture and so forth. And then there was another man who was a joker, the kind of guy who likes to make jokes. And his humor was politically incorrect. But each person is entitled to his jokes. This is America. We have free speech here. At the end of the program, when we were off the air, I learned that the host was a native of West Virginia. And you know, you like to make conversation. So what I said, first thing that popped into my head, was that West Virginia had just elected Joe Manchin, its first Italian-American governor, in the previous November. In response, the fellow who was the co-host, who liked making jokes, he made the gesture of a man reaching inside his coat and pulling out a gun, and then, perhaps jokingly, I'll leave it to you to decide, went on to imply that legions of gun-wielding men had gone all over the great state of West Virginia to coerce the people of that state to elect Joe Manchin as their governor.